If you give them a little more of a story about where the music comes from, they get a little less worried about, I'm doing something wrong, which is one of the main impediments to people learning how to play music.
That's today's guest, educator, musician, and Grammy-nominated composer Russ Gershon on keeping our music making free and not tense. Welcome to Music Ed Insights. I'm leadership trainer and former band director Alan Fire, here with composer and co-college music education program head Steve Shanley.
Each episode, Alan and I talk with national thought leaders in music education with practical insights for K-12 music educators.
Steve, tell us about our guest.
Russ Gershon is a saxophonist, composer, educator, and entrepreneur who's been a pillar of the Boston music scene for over 4 decades. He founded the 10-piece jazz ensemble Orchestra, earning a Grammy nomination for his arranging. Russ has taught elementary band and general music, music history, and jazz history, and has worked as a visiting artist and clinician at colleges around the country. Find Russ's full bio, show notes, and resources at musicedinsights.com. Alan, what was the takeaway you had from this episode?
I loved a simple timeline idea to create engagement, working with students to compare the time of composition, their birthday, their parents' birthdays, and major historical events. What about you?
What stood out to me is how this episode turns into a fun, deep, philosophical conversation about what music means in our students' lives. It's a little different from our usual heavily practical episodes, but those big ideas still translate into powerful classroom moves.
Russ worked with me and my students on several occasions about 25 years ago, and he practices what he preaches. He's always learning alongside his students. Our insiders get to be a part of making this podcast happen. You can learn more at our website. But for now, let's get to Russ Gershon.
Russ Gershon, welcome to the program.
Well, nice to be here.
So you've coached students and teachers in a lot of different settings, mostly outside the traditional year-round K-12 jobs that most of our listeners have. From your vantage point, what do you wish schools, teachers, or even parents understood better about how we should be teaching and experiencing music?
Well, let me update my background. The last 2 years, I've been doing K through 4 general music, 350 kids. And the last 4 years also, I've been teaching a lot of teen jazz ensembles and rock ensembles. But the thing that I always I brought to my college music history teaching, and I bring it to all those little kids, kindergarten through 4th grade, and everybody in between, is that music is not something apart from the rest of life and the rest of the things that we study. You know, it's a window into everything else. It's a window into history. It's a window into how people relate to each other. It's a window into geography. So I'm always trying to connect, especially in those general music classes, but even when I'm teaching ensembles and I'm teaching specific music, I try to connect it to a bigger picture of the world. You know, when I teach little kids, kindergarten kids or 1st graders a song, for example, with my little kids, I've been teaching them Proud Mary, by Creedence.
Creedence, yeah.
So I brought it to them I found some nice videos of the last steamboat that's running on the Mississippi River. So that gave me an opportunity to teach them about the Mississippi River, some geography, about what the Mississippi River has been for the United States, about what a steamboat is. So they get a lesson in all that stuff while they're learning a fun song. And it works in 2 directions because they're trying to remember the words to this song. And the more that they understand the story of the song, the easier it is for them to remember the words. Like all actors will tell you, you try to just remember words, it's really hard. But if you remember motivations and the characters, then you can do it. And I do that when I'm teaching like ensembles, when I'm teaching music, say jazz tunes to teen ensembles, as I don't just sort of throw a tune out there and say, here's some notes on a page, here's some chord symbols that you don't quite understand, but if you really think about it hard, you'll understand them, and you'll not fast enough to improvise on them, but I try to like tell them a little bit about the artist. Who was the artist? When did they live? What were they trying to do? Just put it in a little historical context for them, because once again, the bigger the picture, the more places they have to relate to it. And it also, if you give them a little more of a story about where the music comes from, they get a little less worried about, I'm doing something wrong, which is one of the main impediments to people learning how to play music, especially jazz, but I think all kinds of music. People get constipated by worrying about what they're doing wrong instead of what they're doing. when I teach songs to little kids, this is a concern that I have nowadays, is that history has become flattened for people because there's so much information being dumped into their faces all the time through a million different channels. There's so much present time. There's so much now that it's hard for people sometimes to get a grasp on that there was a past also. There was a then. So the thing I have on my whiteboard that I'm always making them and changing them, but timelines. So when we learn a song, I say, oh, we're learning Blue Skies by Irving Berlin. We go, when was it written? It was written in 1926. And oh, look, that's 100 years ago. What's 100 years ago? Well, this is when your parents were born. This is when your old music teacher was born. This is when you were born, and that sort of thing. So I try to get, and then between that and the maps and the geography, I'm trying to get, sort of give them a sense of the bigger world.
There's some fine musicians that we might know the names of who passed through either orchestra. Could you just name drop for a moment, and maybe some of our listeners who haven't heard of either orchestra or Russ Gershon have heard of?
Well, our most famous alums are John Medeski, keyboard player, piano and organ, and any other keyboard you put in front of him, who has played with the best people in jazz and in rock music. Miguel Zenon, fantastic saxophonist, MacArthur Fellow, Guggenheim Fellow. Jaleel Shaw, another great alto saxophonist, Matt Wilson, drummer. These are all people that have been on the cover of Downbeat magazine subsequently, and so on. And I could go down the list. Even the ones that are not famous like those guys have had great careers as side people or as their own band leaders. And, it's a really illustrious group of people.
Steve, have you done some arranging for Miguel?
Yeah, I just did a little project for him in the fall that I think he just recorded a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
Wow. He's a very talented guy and a very nice person.
Yes. I was very embarrassed that, I was proud to be like the one gringo who was invited to write for this. And one of the reasons is because I kind of know how all of that style is supposed to work.
Oh, good.
Wouldn't you know it, I nailed like 90% of it. There was one spot where I screwed up, where there was an odd number of bars and the clave switched, and I didn't get. I was working too fast, and I didn't get it right in the piano. And of course, no one else I sent it to caught it. Miguel caught it immediately. So yeah, that was.
Well, modern players are so adept that frequently, even if if the arrangement turns the clave around, they'll figure that out quickly and they'll turn the clave around.
Yes.
Go with it.
Yeah.
Which may be a good thing or maybe not.
I would say, especially over here in the United States, when we start talking about world music, the Cuban, Central American, South American, that's probably among the most common, especially in jazz teaching, especially.
Sure.
But Ethiopian music, that is something that we don't hear about as much. So what is Ethiopian pop or any Ethiopian music? What can that teach us about rhythm or ensemble playing or just listening in general?
It's probably one of the most interesting features of Ethiopian modern music, which includes pop and so-called Ethio jazz, is their use of pentatonic modes. Their music is all pretty strictly, it comes out of traditional Ethiopian songs, but as they adapted Western instruments and Western styles to it in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and invented this Ethio jazz that's kind of a hipster fave around the world now, they stuck with the modal melodies. And there's a couple of really oddball modes in there that attract the ears of all of my colleagues and me, because they're so dissonant, or they have 7 modes that most of the songs are in, and some of them would sound familiar. We'd call them a minor pentatonic, major pentatonic, that sort of thing. But they've got a couple real weird modes, and the jazz musicians all love those. There's one called Anchi Hoye, which means more or less, you woman. And it's used for it's a gendered language. It means it's sort of like you, but you're speaking to a woman. It's used for religious songs, like songs of praise, and also a lot of wedding songs. And it has this strange configuration of notes, which I will tell you in numbers right now. It's 1, flat 2, 4, flat 5, and natural 6.
Mm.
It's a really strange scale. There's no whole steps in it, or the inversion, the minor seventh.
Yeah, all
But
basically the toughest intervals to sing and hear, the half steps
exact,
and yeah, major
but
third.
it manages to contain both a diminished triad and
Hmm.
an augmented triad, and it contains parallel fourths a half step apart. So it's got all. It's really juicy. It's got all of these great things in it. They have songs in that where they sing that configuration of notes, and you kind of can't believe that they're singing it. It sounds like they sound like the most modern, uber hip jazz things, and but people there in Ethiopia, hey, they've heard that mode so much they can just sing those songs. It's not a problem. And I've spent years, a lot of time examining that. It's been an interesting process of getting to know the history of how modern Ethiopian music was invented, because the country was fairly isolated from the West for a long time, because they were never fully colonized the way that, say, Nigeria was, or Senegal, or South Africa, or Ethiopia is kind of isolated, is mountainous. It's hard to get in there. When the Italians tried invading in 1896, the Ethiopians beat them back at this battle, the Battle of Adwa. Their music was not known around the world, and they didn't know much of Western music in general until the 30s or 40s. And so
Wow.
it's really interesting. Haile Selassie, their last emperor, became very interested in brass band music because he was serenaded in 1925 on a tour of the Middle East and Europe. He was serenaded by a brass band in Jerusalem, and that brass band consisted of orphans, Armenian orphans, children of the genocide, who were living there in a monastery, an Orthodox monastery, and their sort of caretaker was a musician, and he taught them all to play instruments. And so Haile Selassie heard this brass band playing sort of European style music and became fascinated by it, and he wanted to have that for himself. And that's kind of how Western music started to leak into Ethiopia. He adopted all of the members of the band and took them back to Ethiopia, and began hiring these Armenians, starting with Armenian musicians, to come in and teach Western music in the 30s, so the emperor could have his own marching bands in the Western style. And that seeded the ground for this infusion of Western styles into Ethiopia. So what happened over the 30s and the 40s with these Western musicians coming in, learning about Ethiopian music, and then Ethiopians learning Western instruments and Western songs, is this fusion between Western styles, meaning both classical music and jazz and Latin music, with Ethiopian scales and Ethiopian singing. That's sort of the birth of modern Ethiopian music. And there was a man. There were two people. There's two Nalbandians. There was Kevork Nalbandian, who was the one who taught all the orphans, and then his nephew Nurses Nalbandian, who went to Ethiopia in 1939, who was a young man who became Haile Selassie's favorite musician, and Nurses wound up becoming the head of music at the National Theater when Haile Selassie built it in the 50s. And Nurses was a real music, like American music lover. His son told me that dad's favorite musicians were Xavier Cugat and Ray Charles. So, big band Latin music from the 30s, Cuban and American, and Ray Charles. So this Armenian refugee living in Ethiopia in the 40s and 50s and 60s wound up becoming one of the conduits for Latin music and jazz into Ethiopia. So it's like a totally fascinating case study in how music influence and cultural influences flow in unexpected directions. And the Eid Orchestra's latest album, which just came out, is all we wound up meeting the Nalbandian family on our first visit there in 2004, and they said, these people can play our father's music. Nobody's played it since the revolution in 1973. So our latest album, we got invited. They gave us all the scores and old recordings and stuff, partial scores, very sketchy. And I spent a bunch of time putting them together into playable charts. And we went back in 2011 and played the music in the National Theater, and that's our new album. It's called Nalbandian the Ethiopian. It's out now on all the streaming services. But that's this very interesting sort of person, traveler, refugee, immigrant, who wound up, helping to change the music culture of a whole country with his work. And then there's many other interesting bio music stories in Ethiopian music that we've discovered. We've had the privilege of playing with the best singers and instrumentalists of that sort of early generation, the generation that came up in the 60s and invented this modern music. And so I've gotten it right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. A lot of these stories and a lot of the music we've played with these great people like Mahamud Ahmed, Mulatu Estatke, Tashome Metiku, Getachew Makuria. And you can find a lot of their music on the Ethiopics series.
If you were to direct our listeners to one either orchestra track that you wrote that's using the Anchihoya mode, what would that one track be?
Amlak Abet Abet. Amlak Abet Abet. And you can find it on two different albums. There's a studio version on the album called More Beautiful Than Death. And then there's a live version on the album called Live in Addis, Addis, like Addis Ababa.
Yeah.
And that's on the Ethiopics series, actually.
So my daughter, she's 22 and she's a genius. And she has convinced me of something. When I made a disparaging remark when she talked about one of her friends who was a philosophy major. A couple of years ago, she said, a philosophy degree is one of the most practical degrees you can have because it's one of the few majors that you can apply to any profession that you end up in. So she convinced me of that. And I had a sales rep for the printing company that I use who was also a philosophy major. And I brought this up to him, and he was able to explain how he used a degree in philosophy to help him be more effective at managing accounts for a printing company. So you started, I thought so. So now it's your turn. So you started with a philosophy degree from Harvard, but now you've led either orchestra, you've another groups, you've run a label, you've freelanced, you teach everyone from kids to pros. How have you connected that philosophy degree to the way that you've built your musical life? And this is not a music degree. We can have other interests besides music and still be a musician. So can you draw a through line on the philosophy degree to these others?
Yeah, well, the philosophy degree, you can sort of take it let's take it at the opposite ends. There's the totally sort of practical level of, if you study philosophy, you're trained to read texts really carefully. That's it's philosophy, for better or for worse, is a lot of words chasing their own tails, right? And so you're forced to learn how to really, really understand what people are saying in complicated sentences and understand what their point is. You don't have to believe, they don't have to convince you, but you have to at least be able to understand how they're going about their argument. That's useful information for reading contracts, for following instructions, for doing anything, really. Learning how to read carefully and really understand what people are saying. So there's that. On the cosmic level, the other end, studying philosophy is about ethics. It's about epistemology. It's about aesthetics. It's like an epistemology seems like an especially good thing to understand these days, with so many people in the public sphere lying to us all the time, and so much fragmentation of the information channels that people pay attention to. Epistemology is the study of how do we know what we know. And so it's sort of like the basis of critical thinking, of assessing where the information is coming from and how the people who claim that there is information there, how they are justifying its truth value. If you get deep enough into philosophy, you realize that in the end, it's sort of floating on air, I mean, then you sort of have to step from past philosophy into religion and into faith to say, well, okay, in the end, I believe this stuff because I believe it. But before you get there, it's all about coherence. It's about do these arguments make sense and fit together? And that applies to understanding science. When we try to understand medical knowledge, do medical treatments work? How does science work? It's all about coherence. It's about, well, okay, here's a scientific experiment that fits with all these other scientific experiments. They agree in their results. Here's somebody else that reproduced the same scientific experiment and they got the same results. So we can start to believe that the theories that are being tested there they're probably true. But on the other hand, it might get disproved in the future. So philosophy of science is so important right now, with people trying to kick the legs out from underneath scientific knowledge, people in our government. And then when you want to talk about ethical philosophy, or, it's not so much important whether you believe a particular ethics system, but what we study in philosophy is how what's the argument that's being made? What is good? Is that because God told us that? Is it because it produces better results for more people? Is it because if you invert it, like through the golden rule or the Kant's, categorical imperative,
Imperative.
does it work in both directions? So it's more like understanding how are we justifying our morality more than saying you have to believe a Christian God or a Muslim God or no God at all, or 50 naked deities running around in trees or whatever. It's sort of saying, okay, what is the argument that's being made here? I mean, to me, it's the philosophy study was incredibly useful every day, all the time.
Love it. I love all that stuff. I was just looking on Spotify. I love the album covers are so awesome to these, and I love the most recent one. What's that photo from?
Oh, the Nalbandian, the Ethiopian.
Yeah.
That's a picture of Nalbandian, the refugee from Armenia who wound up leading the National Theater Orchestra. That's him. He's the non-Ethiopian looking guy in the middle. I think he's at the piano in that picture, maybe, surrounded by his Ethiopian band, which took the form of a big band.
So what year would that photo have been approximately?
That's probably around when the theater opened, which was 1956. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty good guess.
I love it.
It's such a good, yeah.
I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. Like because of Spotify, more people are going to hear this music than probably otherwise would have. So that's good. But man,
Yep.
we lose something when we don't have the actual thing to hold in our hand and see this awesome album cover.
Amen, brother. And I've never understood, maybe it's just because the terms were sort of created for digital stuff early on before the bandwidth was, I don't know. I've never understood why you can't access all the graphics, why they didn't make that part
Yeah, the liner
of
notes and the
of
list of the
the
musicians.
streaming
Yeah.
thing,
Mhm.
all that stuff. Because and those Ethiopics albums, that series, they do such a beautiful job with the graphics and the presentation that it's really worth it to see the way there's great notes in there. I mean, Francis Falsetto, the curator of the series, wrote great notes. I wrote a really extensive set of notes about how I dealt with the music, the different ways, dealing with partial scores and recordings and how we assembled it and how much liberties we took so that if future ethnomusicologists want to understand what they're hearing, there's a pretty clear explanation. This is straight up. This is somewhat messed with. This is totally messed with,
Yeah.
so that they understand what was my part and our part in adding to it and what was the original text, as it were.
Well, Russ, thank you so much for joining us to talk about these important topics today. Can we close down with the lightning round on some lighter subjects?
Sure.
All right. What's your favorite restaurant in Boston these days?
I'll give you a few. For a really incredible view, if you're there in the warm weather, sit on the terrace at the Real House, Reel, in East Boston. So there's that. If you want to spend a lot for a really fantastic multi-course price fixed meal, go to Mooncusser.
How about a musical artist or a group or even just a song that you want more people to know about?
I'm just going to sing the praises of my colleague from Iowa, Rick McLaughlin.
Rick.
Rick, he was a bass player who plays and played in the Either Orchestra for 30 years. I'm playing in two other bands with him. I hire him for pickup bands. He's a incredibly great bass player, totally easy to work with guy, and really has a very expanding mind about music, which he's had to have to work with me all that time because we've done so many different kinds of music together, from playing weddings and playing commercial music to the most esoteric stuff. And he's always like, he just says yes to everything and approaches it with a great attitude and figures out what's good about it. So let's hear it for the product of West Des Moines, Rick McLaughlin.
Yeah, we'll take it. Yeah. How about a favorite film or TV series you've enjoyed recently?
I'm a sucker for medical shows, and the show, The Pit, that's on right now is pretty great.
All right. The toughest question for most of our guests, the most memorable music performance or concert you've attended. And if you want to cheat and just go recently, that's fine too.
That's a really great question. I've been lucky that I grew up near and around New York City in the 70s when I was getting into jazz. So I heard it was just a banquet. So let me mention one that changed my life. It was in April of 1975. I had tickets that just said jazz concert that my dad gave to me. He was an ad executive, so he got a lot of sort of merch and stuff given to him. he didn't realize he was what he was doing to me. So it was in Carnegie Hall. So my friend and I went down to Carnegie Hall, and it turned out to be a tribute to Coltrane concert. This is 1975, so Coltrane was not even dead 10 years. It was a triple bill. The first band was Alice Coltrane playing organ with Charlie Hayden and Rashid Ali. The second band was Pharoah Sanders with his band. This is vintage 1975 Pharoah Sanders. And then the third artist was Rahsaan Roland Kirk, who I'd never even heard of. I'd sort of vaguely heard of the other ones. And so he walked out on stage blind, covered with saxophones and instruments, and played and just completely blew my mind. And I can say pretty safely that the reason I'm here with you today, it pivoted that day at Carnegie Hall. And many years later, I got to play Carnegie Hall, and I looked for the seats. I remembered what seats we were in, and I was like, that was it. That was the spot. Although they've renovated the hall since then, so it's configured a little bit. They took out the proscenium, but yeah. So that's a good one.
That's a great answer. I love it. All right, and finally, a book recommendation for our listeners, please.
I'll give you a fun music bio. Is Hal Blaine's book, Hal Blaine and the Wrecking Crew.
Wrecking Crew, yeah.
That's a really fun book. He wrote it himself. Clearly, he's not a professional writer.
Yeah.
But you hear him talking. This guy who's in the middle of everything for many years.
Russ Gershon, it's great to see you again, and wonderful to hear from you today. Thanks so much for joining us for this awesome conversation.
My pleasure. My favorite topics.
Thanks for listening to Music Ed Insights.
We're supported by Group Dynamic, a leading provider of youth leadership workshops. Alan works with dozens of schools each year to help develop their leaders. Learn more at groupdynamicyouth.com.
Or you could email me at alan@groupdynamic.net. Also sponsored by the Co-College Music Education Program. They've got a website too.
Just click their link at our website or email me at shanley@coe.edu.
Also, The Normal Design, helping normal companies and people create memorable, meaningful, and professional designs and branding. More at thenormaldesign.com.
And Winterset Websites, website design and maintenance. wintersetwebsites.com.
Our Facebook page is Music Ed Insights.
Our website has program notes, links, and a one-page download of this episode's key takeaways. That's on musicedinsights.com.
You can expect a new episode most Mondays during the school year.
Get current.
Stay relevant.
Music Ed Insights.